set this up. First of all, thank you so much for feeding me. That's always a plus. I almost forgot that I actually had the talk. I was like, oh, really? So if I doze off, I apologise. So as I said, my name's Craig. I'm a volunteer for Beyond Blue. In the real world, I work for New South Wales Health. I'm one of the instructional designers there. So what I usually do is, like I said, I've been doing this for 7 years. I usually come to areas or places like here, where I'll just talk about obviously my experience with anxiety and depression. There's opportunities for questions and discussions at the end. I will be talking at you for 25 minutes, so please, if you need to go to the toilet, if you need to go up, or if you need to even lay your head down for a little quick nap, I don't mind. I was saying it before, I used to train systems to people for 8 hours. I've seen worse. So please don't hesitate. If you start feeling emotional, please, once again, I'm happy for you to take a step out if you need to. I guess what I'll be sharing with you is my own personal experiences. Every answer to every question I'll give you is once again from my own personal experience. I'm not a medical professional. If there is questions that do go to that level, then I'll just tell you what I can tell you from my experience, but always good to seek a medical professional. So I'm very proud to represent Beyond Blue. I'm a volunteer as well as a speaker. So volunteering means I'm at the fates and hand out pamphlets to people as well at games and stuff like that. Beyond Blue is an organisation that's been around for 20 years now. Its key aim is to promote mental health and wellbeing, provide advice and support, and work to prevent suicide. Beyond Blue is here to help every person in Australia, whatever their age, and wherever they live, to achieve the best possible mental health. I'd like to share some statistics with you. Sorry to throw numbers at you, but I ask that you reflect on them, just for a moment, if you could. So today in Australia, more than 1 million people are experiencing depression. More than 2 million people are experiencing a condition related to anxiety. Every day in Australia, 8 people will take their lives. And we know that 1 in 6 women and 1 in 8 men will experience depression in their lifetime. The numbers increase when we start to talk about anxiety, as 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men are likely to experience anxiety in their time. As we know, with for every suicide attempt, there's tragic repercussions for family, friends, partners, colleagues, and the broader community. It's likely that most of us here have some experience with anxiety, depression, or suicide, whether it's personally or whether it's with someone we know. And mental health conditions don't discriminate. They can affect people of every age and at any stage in your life. So today, my hope is that we can start a conversation about mental health that inspires you to check in on those around you, but also empowers you to look after your own mental health and well-being. So there's a common misconception when it comes to mental health, is that people with anxiety and depression can just snap out of it, or that anxiety and depression indicate some form of weakness in character. And I can tell you, obviously, nothing can be further from the truth. Depression is a lot more than just a low mood. It's a serious illness that impacts you both physically as well as mentally. With depression, you lose interest in work, you start losing interest in hobbies, and the things that you usually enjoy just don't have that joy to them anymore. You start to lack energy, you have difficulty sleeping, or you start sleeping more than usual. Anxiety, well, that's more than just feeling stressed or worried. While stress and feeling anxious are very common, everyone will feel stressed and anxious in their lifetime. Anxiety is where the anxiousness stays with you even when the stressor is gone, even outside of that stressing situation. Anxiety is when these feelings don't subside. It's when the feelings are ongoing and they exist without any particular reason. or cause. It's a serious condition that makes it hard for people to cope with actual daily life. The good news is, obviously, is that there's a lot of support out there, and I've seen the support over the years that I've done this getting better and stronger, and there's a lot more promotion on there. And whether it's talking to a family member or a friend or your GP or your mental health professional, anxiety and depression doesn't have to take over our lives anymore. They're not weaknesses, and people shouldn't feel ashamed to speak up or seek support. So I became a speaker for Beyond Blue so I could share my story. I wanted to share it so I could increase the community's understanding about mental health. And while this is a serious story, feel free, you're allowed to smile, you're allowed to laugh. Or like I said before, if you feel anything deeper, I'm here afterwards for questions. And I can share some resources with you as well. So let me give you a little backstory on me. Okay, so I'm Filipino Australian. I'm the youngest of 3 brothers, which means everyone who has brothers would know that the youngest is the best. All right, so the youngest, let's be honest, the youngest is usually the one who's off with the fairies. So that was me. My dad, God bless his soul, and as you can hear from my accent, it's not very Filipino. My dad was your very typical Oka Aussie. He was very much part of that old school. I was born in Sydney, a place called Kensington, right near Randwick. And I lived there for some years, but my dad was a horse trainer, so we moved up to a horse stud up in Scone. My brothers and I were raised in that very strong tradition of boys don't cry. Don't be a sook, or even worse, don't be a girl. Which is really funny to me because every girl and woman I've known in my life are incredibly strong. My beautiful wife, who even after 15 years of marriage to me, is still my rock and still the strongest person I know. I haven't worn it down yet. But when I was with my 2 older brothers, there wasn't much time for weakness when you were just boys being boys. There was only really 2 emotions that were taught to us as boys: happiness and anger. Not much in between. As we were becoming men, we were told we all had a job to do. Not even men, even as adults. We all get told that we have this job to do, but no one told you what the job was, but it just had to be done. I never really fit in school. If anyone knows the Upper Hunter, I was never good at girls, fighting or sport. So therefore it crossed me out of a lot of things when it came to my area up there. But I realised that these unrealistic men's standards would sow the seeds for anxiety and depression in my later life. Because it was these years of what I would consider conditioning that fed my version of what a man and a provider should be. I call that man the impossible man. It's that ideal that I always push and I always attack myself for never becoming. And these teachings from my youth were so ingrained in me that when I finally suffered from anxiety and depression, I didn't even know what was happening because my emotional intelligence was just so stunted. Unfortunately, a healthy emotional intelligence is something that's quite lacking in a lot of today's culture. No one ever taught me to understand what I was feeling or even how to talk about it. I was always taught that an emotion was a leak in the boat. I've always been this impulsive guy, so it was really odd to me when I started to overthink things. Simply waking up feeling happy would end up being this large argument in my head about how I had to be serious instead, and I didn't deserve to have such childish feelings. And so when I started to struggle, and I sometimes still do, there are 2 main areas in which I struggle. The first is arguments in my head. We all have these sometimes. We all have these fictional arguments and confrontations in our head. And let's be honest, we're always the best arguer in the world. We're the wittiest, we're the meanest person. We always win the argument in our head. But here's the problem with it is you actually feel angry having a fictional argument. So you actually leave a fictional argument with a real life emotion affecting your body. And so the second thing that I start to do is I start to withdraw from people when I'm feeling bad. Where I just get that thing, look, I need to get away from it all. I start looking for a quiet room so I can have a read of my phone or a book or something I like. And this is particularly hard for me because I have a 9-year-old boy, I have a very chatty wife, so it's hard for me to find that peace and quiet. So silence isn't a thing that really happens often to me. But sadly, at the time of my issues, I did not know what I needed, so it all just went in circles. I just wanted to be left alone. And when I was alone, I would spend that time in fictional arguments in my head, which would trigger my body's emotion, and it would exhaust me even further. I felt like all I needed was a good night's sleep. But this never happened because the second my head hit the pillow, I'd become restless. And so it just kept going and going. And then I felt like it was a weakness if I asked someone for help. But because I refused to speak to anyone, no one even had a chance to actually help me understand what was going on. And because I was a man, I was an adult at this time, no one thought it was relevant to teach me. Ironically, I'd always thought I was able to steer clear of anxiety and depression. I'd always seemed to get through the issues that life threw at me. See, I come from what you would call a broken home. We were a low-income family that constantly struggled with emotions, drinking, verbal altercations, and inevitably violence. And so I remember when I got diagnosed, I thought, this is really weird, like, I've carried heavier issues than this, I've been through worse than this. But the truth was, I carried it for too long. It's the old saying, the straw that broke the camel's back. And I'd been too long by myself that something had to give. So before all of this happened, when I was 27, I met my wife, who supported me, she loved me, we got engaged, got married, everything was going great. When I was 33, I'm 43 now just for reference, my wife told me she was pregnant. I always wanted to be a dad. My dad was the most amazing man I ever knew. He was our shining light in that broken home. He taught me so much about love and family. He was a great father who did the best with what he was taught. But it's funny, only now, with life experiences I've had, I know that he suffered similar problems than me. But an odd thing occurred. When my wife told me she was pregnant, the impossible man kicked in. And I hadn't heard this impossible man in my head for years. But suddenly he kicked in and said, well, you're going to be a dad. You've got to make changes around here. So I started to take life more seriously. I needed to be a provider for my family. My wife started to notice that I started to laugh less and become more serious. I just explained to her, look, darling, don't worry about it. I'm going to be an adult, I've got a kid coming. I needed to be the best provider I can, like my dad was. And this hurt me because I'm usually a goofball. And now I'm trying to be someone I'm not. And it hurt my wife too because I wasn't the man she fell in love with. So I did what I thought all adults had to do. Whenever you get up into any stress or drama, I thought I just have to push through it. I worked hard. I worked more overtime. I started to be more ambitious. And then an opportunity arose at work when several of my managers resigned, which should have been a red flag, but I saw it as an opportunity. And so I was made a high-level manager at my work. I had a big job, I had my own office, and I had one of those long titles that had the word statewide in it. In my mind, I was like, wow, I'm becoming this impossible man. And then in January 2013, my son was born. And I was there for him when I could. When I wasn't off for work, when I wasn't doing that late report, when I wasn't thinking about work. And I was a great dad, but only when I was present. At work, here I was doing the job that I never thought I would do, nor did I really ever wanted to do. And I was doing okay at it. And it was at this time, as anyone who knows who's gone into bigger roles, you become a bigger target as well. And in hindsight, look, I'll be honest, I was very much an easy target as well. See, I'm a firm believer in working collaboratively, all about getting a desired result together. But then suddenly I was in these meeting rooms where targeting was used more than resolution. At first, I wanted what was best for my team. So I wasn't prepared for when my managers come up to me and say, don't help this person, don't help that person. Keep quiet in this meeting. Oh, great, Craig, you ruined my plan. You do their work on your time. And I was also waiting for the worst thing. I was waiting for them to find out I was a fraud. I was waiting for them to find out that they made some horrible mistake and they were all just going to suddenly charge into my room and my managers into my office and just go, yeah, Craig, we made a mistake. You're the weakest link. Time to go. See, I'd never been a high-level manager before, so I did bite off more than I could chew. My managers would send through projects and requests that confused me. And when I would ask for clarity, I would leave feeling more confused and more dumb. Their deadlines were getting shorter and shorter, just so their managers can get it to their managers quicker and quicker. My training was the old sink and swim, and they would mentor me with abrupt phone calls and rude emails. And they would give me off-the-cuff comments about how they regretted hiring me or my lack of knowledge. And it was funny, every new phone call, email or meeting, it got so bad that every time I would hear that ding, it would feel like dread pouring over my body. My body would feel like it was being covered in tar. I started to feel heavy and I started to feel tired. And so I guess with that smell of blood in the water, a colleague who believed they could do better in my role started to actively work against me. It started by them arguing over every decision I made within the team and then in front of the team. And then suddenly it felt like everyone was questioning me. And that tar feeling started to harden and I started to feel slower and I started to feel slower. I would get home and I would be so numb, I would just turn off. And I could sit and just stare for lengths of time. So not to scare my wife, I'd just turn the TV on and just stare at it. I wouldn't know what I watched. I'd just stare blankly. My son, who at the time was now 2 years old, and I was trying to live up to my father's standards, and I was getting angry at myself because I was never a good enough father. I was never a good enough husband, and I was definitely not the good enough man. The impossible man kept telling me I wasn't providing. And because he spoke in my own voice, I believed him. My darling wife started to struggle because I started to get easily frustrated with her. She would check on me and I would snap. Look, I'm not a baby, I would say. Just leave me alone. I just need a breath. I need a rest, okay? Good night's sleep, I'll be fine. And that started to put stress on our young family. Back at work, my colleague who was targeting me, it started to feel like she was right more often and I was wrong more often. I remember a day when I had to speak to my colleague and it was over something that they did and it was wrong. And I had to go up to her and say, look, can we have a talk? And she rudely said something back. And I said, look, listen, you can't speak to me like that. Can we go into the office and talk? And I remember thinking in my brain, ooh, look, I'm being assertive. This is great. I'm getting somewhere. And we both went into the office and she just trampled all over me. I ended up sitting, I remember I was sitting there just crestfallen on the side of a desk, apologising for something that I had every right to do. I had gone head to head with one of the villains in my life and I lost. And I remember thinking, she's right. I'm just not good at this. It was at this point I discovered my colleague had been reporting on me to higher managers. And I only found this out because of a forgotten email trail. After my lost fight, I was so terrified of this girl that I just avoided her. And I started to give her more power. Because I thought, well, I'm failing enough in every other department. I didn't want to fail anymore in this one. And then one day, I parked my car outside of work and I couldn't move. At first I thought I was having a stroke as my body started to stop listening to me. My heart started to race so hard I could feel it outside of my chest. My skin started to feel like it was curdling, and I could feel everything around me like someone had actually stripped my skin to just bare nerves. And then in my car, in the parking lot in front of my work, I started to cry and cry and cry. And I don't think I left my car for a good hour. Looking back, that was my first ever panic attack. Then when I finally managed to walk into work, it seemed like everything changed. It seemed like suddenly everyone was at the windows watching me cry in my car, and everyone knew and confirmed that Craig was failing. And so I started to try to think of ways around it. Even though I could hear sarcasm in everyone's voice, suddenly I could see disappointment in everyone's face. So I tried to learn to work with my emotions. I would cry in bathrooms before meetings. I would start to schedule things around midday, which was my peak performance time, as I was way too emotional in the morning and I was way too exhausted in the afternoon. At home, my poor darling wife just felt helpless. She just couldn't understand, as she wasn't trained in anxiety and depression. Like, here's a tip for people to help a friend or family member in these times. Like, if you break your leg, you wouldn't try to fix it yourself. You get a medical professional to do it, someone who's qualified to fix it. And this is the same with mental health. You don't need to understand the issue. You just need to be there with them. And just seek them and urge them and support them to get mental health and seek professional advice. When I finally went to the doctors, I remember feeling incredibly embarrassed. I could see people go in with injuries. I vividly remember this older gentleman come in, and he must have fallen down the stairs. He had bandages on his arms, he had bandages on his head, and you could just see he had open sores on him from where he'd just fallen and bruised. And all I had was just red eyes from crying. And I thought, I'm in the wrong place. But then the part of me knew I was making a small step in the right direction. And so my GP, he gave me a referral to an amazing psychologist. And the psychologist took me into the practice, and he never laid me down and asked me about my mum. He never did any he never, did all of that stuff you see in the movies. No, didn't do any of it. He just, instead of dragging up old failures, instead of throwing prescription drugs at me, he just listened. And I just felt like there was a wave washing through my mind, flushing out all the build-up in my brain. And then he diagnosed me with anxiety and depression. My psychologist helped me map out my thoughts. He's like a physio for your brain. He didn't talk about my broken home. His exact words, and I'm sorry for the language, he'd said, stirring shit still makes it shit. He never talked about that. He talked about, why did you have unfair standards put on yourself? He never taught me to love myself. He showed me ways that I could take it easy on myself. He helped me understand my thinking process and gave me strategies on how to fix them. Because with all my angry managers, all my conniving colleagues, all of other life pressures, the loudest voice, my worst feeling, was always me. It was always my voice in my own head. So at this time, I'd exhausted my sick leave, and my mental health had taken my body to a bad place. I was getting regularly admitted into the John Hunter with stomach pains, and then one day chest pains. And then I realised I needed to leave, and I resigned from work. And it was so funny, on my last days of work, so many people would come up to me and say shocked how they were, because they thought I was doing a great job. But my anxiety never let me believe them. Even though, ironically, every job I've gotten since then has been based upon the reputation I had in that role. So the role itself taught me a lot about myself, and taught me a lot of what I wanted in my career. and what did I want it as a workplace and what did I want it as a home. And so it's funny now, as a trainer, instructional designer I am now, I wanted to try to think of ways to get the concept of mental health across to people. So now when people ask me what it's like, I liken it to a sports injury. It's like that, think of it like a knee injury. You know, it's the one that, you'll know it'll never be as good as it used to be. But you need to learn how to play again. So you need to be careful with the pressure you put on it. You realise what adds to the strain, you've got to learn what adds to the strain, and what are the best things that lessen it. You can always sense the injuries there, but you need to learn how to work around it and not aggravate it. Sometimes I wish it was more like a physical injury. Sometimes I wish people could see the gigantic wound, and there would be more understanding on the days when it hurt the most. It's hard to explain to people sometimes that, I almost cried because I tried to put the button on my shirt and my button wouldn't go in the shirt, which then told my brain that, oh great, this is going to be a start of a bad day. Which would then snowball into going, well, you're bad at bad days. And then would lead to a spiral which could last for a day, a week. All over a button. It's hard to get that pain and confusion across to people. But thankfully, it's been several years since those days, and I haven't had a full-blown anxiety attack in a long time. I still very much have my bad days. I still have moments when I think I'm going to have an attack, but thankfully I can see the road now before I take it. I know my triggers now. My first trigger is when I recognise I'm withdrawing again. Instead of searching for that moment of peace, I stop and I become mindful. I lean into life now instead of leaning and out of my head. I play toys or Xbox with my son. I ask my wife questions and just listen to her. Ironically, I find peace in their madness. I now let the physical feelings of anxiety just flow through me. It's a lot easier. It's like vines. The more I fight it, the more it gets caught up in you. So sometimes you just need to get out of its way, and it usually goes away in about 10-15 minutes. The second big trigger that I talked about earlier, fictional arguments, as silly as it sounds, I now stop the argument in my head. I can imagine a fight, therefore I can imagine me finishing the fight. So instead of getting into the fight in my head, I just say, yeah, look, I don't want to argue about it. And I walk away in my mind. And ironically, it works. Because your brain is like a Google search. Whatever you put into it, it's going to search. Your whole experiences, your life, your emotions, to find what you want it to find. So, the other remedy, ironically, I found for fictional confrontations was I started to get physical confrontations. So I found a thing called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. For those who don't know, it's a form of wrestling, grappling, martial arts. If you ever watch UFC fights, when they fall to the ground and try to break each other's arms and choke stuff, yeah, it's that. It's weird. It's a weird thing to jump to, I know, but it helps me become mindful. It helps me to be present, especially when someone's trying to choke you. It also helps me keep thinking under pressure. It taught me a lot about my own masculinity, and it taught me a lot about my own ego, especially when you're constantly getting beaten by like 15, 16-year-old girls. I'm not good at it. I do it, I'm not good at it. But it helps you reevaluate your strength, and it helps you reevaluate yourself as a human being. Whilst I'm not consistent in Jiu-Jitsu as I used to be, it's shown me the key to my exercise. The key is exercise to my well-being, especially functional fitness. I need to go do something where my mind cannot wander. Whether it's working in the garden, whether it's, doing some climbing or something like that, or doing basketball that I love. I can't get on the treadmill because my mind will still drift off into the fog. The hardest part of my recovery, obviously, is being able to trust myself again. When I have negative thoughts, I have to ask myself, well, what are the facts behind that thought? What are my experiences that back this thought? And from doing this, I find that the impossible man doesn't speak as loud as he used to. He no longer states my fears as fact. I still see my psychologist once in every while, mainly just for checkups. I do take medication for depression, but I've been able to reduce it. by most of it over time. I'm very aware of the energy I give to situations now and whether they are worth it, and how much energy is given and how much is taken from people. I pretty much take each day as it comes. I don't spend too much time in the future. I do not give much energy to the past. I'm passionate about promoting mental health, and as I said in the intro, anxiety and depression do not discriminate, and it's only when we recognise that this condition isn't a weakness that we'll be able to understand and let go of the stigma around it. So here I am today, in front of you all. I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm a father. I don't have any exceptional traits, but I don't have any exceptional weaknesses either. I'm proud of what I've achieved so far in my life. I'm a better person now than I ever was, and I aim to be better every day. I'm more loving and patient. I'm more of a doting father and a caring husband. I'm also more assertive, and I'm more wise with my energy. I love who I've become, and I'm hopeful about who I could be. It's funny, there's this quote that stuck with me lately. It's by a Mexican poet named Octavio Paz. And it says, "Beyond myself, somewhere, I await my arrival." To me, it's a quote that speaks of hope. I see me at the end of this journey, looking back, smiling at what I overcame to be here, and to be proud of my story. And this is my story. So thank you, guys.